Hello and welcome to Neo Psychology of me, your teacher, Mr. Neo, the channel where I teach online psychology lessons for my wonderful students. Today we're carrying on with the attachment unit and we're looking at lesson 10, Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. Let's get started. Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. Mother's love in infancy and childhood is as important for mental health as are vitamins and proteins for physical health. John Bowlby. What does this mean? Do you agree? We had a look at Bowlby before, or John Bowlby, and his ideas. Let's have a look at his theory of maternal deprivation. We have already looked at Bowlby's monotropic theory of attachment. This lesson is concerned with his earlier theory of maternal deprivation. Maternal deprivation, what does that even mean? Talk to me, help me out. Maternal, meaning mother, and deprivation, to go without. So maternally deprived people are people that have gone without a mother, or usually a parent. This theory focuses on how the effects of early experiences may interfere with the usual processes of attachment formation. Bowlby proposed that separation from the mother or mother substitute has a serious effect on psychological development. John Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation focused on the idea that the continual presence of nurture and love from a mother or mother substitute is essential for normal psychological development of babies and toddlers, both emotionally and intellectually. So John Bowlby, he really believed in the importance of the mother, right? The mother being the loving, nurturing sort of caregiver. And this attachment that you have with your mother affects your emotional and intellectual development. You may agree, you may disagree, that's absolutely up to you, but this was Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. So as we saw before, Bowlby famously said that mother's love in infancy and childhood is as important for mental health as are vitamins and proteins for physical health. Being separated from a mother in early childhood, maternal deprivation, has serious consequences, according to Bowlby. Now, if you remember, Bowlby grew up in London. He was a Londoner. He grew up in quite a good, rich, middle-class family. His father was a surgeon, and he only spent a little bit of time with his mother. It's believed that his nanny was his primary attachment figure. And then by the age of 8, I think he was sent to a boarding school. But Bowlby believed that being separated from your mother is not a good thing. The more time spent with your mother, the better. So, we've got 3 learning objectives today. Show comprehension and apply knowledge of Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. We're going to identify and analyze Bowlby's 44 Thieves study from which he built this theory from. And then we're going to discuss and evaluate Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. Let's start with learning objective 1. Show comprehension and apply knowledge of Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. Right, we've got 2 ideas here, separation and deprivation. Now, there is an important distinction to be made between separation and deprivation. Separation simply means the child's not being in the presence of the primary attachment figure. It's more a physical thing, okay? If your mother is physically in another country, you are physically separated, okay? That doesn't necessarily mean you've been deprived, okay? This only becomes an issue for development if the child is deprived or deprivation, i.e. they lose an element of her care. Brief separations, particularly where the child is with a substitute caregiver, are not significant for development, but extended separations can lead to deprivation, which by definition causes harm, according to John Bowlby. So there are two key distinctions here. We've got separation, which is the child not being in the presence of the mother or the primary attachment figure, and then deprivation, the child not getting the emotional care or love from the mother, the primary attachment figure. So, if we were to break this down, you could have a mother that is separated from their child, so they're physically separated, but they may not be deprived of love. Maybe they're getting emotional love and nurture from them some way or form. You could be separated physically from your mother, but then also deprived. And this is what Bowlby suggested. If you're separated for long periods, you are depriving them. But bear in mind, in Bowlby's time, they didn't have things like mobile phones or video chats. Okay. You could not be separated from your mother and therefore not be deprived of love, which is ideally what we would want. You have the mother present and therefore giving the love. But also, just because you're not separated and the mother is present, she may not be offering love or care or being nurturing, so therefore you may be deprived of love or that emotional care. Now, Bowlby brought in this theory of the critical period. He learnt about it from Lorenz's geese, who had a critical period in imprinting, which was a few hours after hatching. He looked at Harlow's work, who also identified a critical period in monkeys and found that if an attachment hadn't been made in the first 90 days, it would never be formed. And Harlow and Bowlby also agreed with this idea of a critical period. Bowlby saw the first 30 months, 2 to 2.5 years of life as a critical period for psychological development. If a child is separated or from the mother in the absence of suitable substitute care, and so therefore deprived of her emotional care for an extended period, this critical period, then psychological damage was inevitable. Okay, Bowlby believed that in this first 30 months, in the first 2.5 years of a child's life, if there's a lot of deprivation of emotional care, there was going to be psychological damage. And we're going to have a look at what type of psychological damage that was. First of all, there was effects on intellectual development. One way in which maternal deprivation affects children's development is their intellectual development. I'm looking like a meme. Bowlby believed that if children were deprived of maternal care for too long during the critical period, they would suffer delayed intellectual development, characterized by abnormally low IQ. This has been demonstrated in studies of adoption. Those people that are maternally deprived in the critical period or the first 2.5 years of their life are more likely to have a low IQ. It's found that there are effects on your intellectual development. Right? Has this been backed up by some research? Yes. Okay. Goldfarb in 1947 found lower IQ. Now, IQ is a measurement of intelligence. Okay. Goldfarb found lower IQ in children who had remained in institutions like orphanages, as opposed to those who were fostered and thus had a higher standard of emotional care. Those that were adopted ended up having a normal IQ, whereas those that weren't adopted and stayed in the orphanage and therefore were maternally deprived, that affected their intellectual development and therefore had a lower IQ, according to Goldfarb's research. The second way that Bowlby suggested that being deprived of a mother can affect you is it affects your emotional development. A second major way in which being deprived of a mother figure's emotional care affects children is their emotional development. Bowlby identified this term, affectionless psychopathy, as the inability to experience guilt or strong emotions for others. What Bowlby suggested was if you are deprived of a mother, you are more likely to be a, quote, affectionless psychopath. This is someone who doesn't feel guilt or remorse for their actions and can't really empathize with somebody else. You can't really put yourself in other people's shoes. You can't understand how somebody else is feeling. This prevents the person developing normal relationships and is associated with criminality. Affectionless psychopaths cannot appreciate the feelings of victims and so lack remorse for their actions. Now, bear in mind that if you're a psychopath, you're not necessarily a murderer, okay? Like it says here, someone that is a psychopath, they don't feel remorse, they don't feel empathy. So it can lead to criminality, it can lead to people doing bad things to people because they don't feel because they don't feel that other people really matter, or they can't empathize that that's how other people are feeling, if they're feeling sad or hurt or stressed or angry. But it doesn't necessarily lead to criminality. Right. Maternal deprivation. Can you write a good definition like I've got on the left? Fill in the gaps, 2 minutes, pause the video, give it a go now, please. Otherwise, let's get started. Maternal deprivation. It is the emotional and intellectual consequences of separation between a child and their mother or mother substitute. Bowlby proposed that continuous care from a mother is essential for normal psychological development, and that prolonged separation from this adult causes serious damage and is therefore deprivation and causes damage to emotional and intellectual development. Okay. Here we go. Application question. We've just learned the AO1 stuff. Let's apply what we've learned to this scenario. Okay. A deprived study. Can you quote parts of the question in your answer? William Goldfarb followed up 30 orphaned children to age 12. Of the original sample, half had been fostered by 4 months of age, whilst the other half remained in an orphanage. At 12, their IQ was assessed using a standard IQ test called the Stanford Binet test. It was found that the fostered group have an average IQ of 96, whereas the group that remained in the orphanage averaged only 68, below the cutoff point used to define intellectual disability. Explain Goldfarb's results using Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. One thing you need to know for this question is the average IQ is 100, okay? The average IQ is 100. 96 is just below average, okay? Whereas 68 is significantly below average, okay? Write your answer to that question. Give yourself 5 minutes. Write your answer down. Actually write it, okay? Pause the video, write the answer, because I'm going to go through the answer now. Explain Goldfarb's results using Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. Bowlby explained Goldfarb's results by saying that the orphanage group had suffered maternal deprivation throughout the critical period. This maternal deprivation led to mental retardation, or intellectual disability disorder is what we call it now, hence the low IQ of the orphanage group. The fostered group, on the other hand, had had an acceptable mother substitute through most of the critical period, so their IQ returned to normal. So in the sample, there's 30 children. Half of them were fostered, half of them remained in the orphanage. Those that were fostered, their IQ was around 96, just below average, not significantly low. However, those that stayed in the orphanage were not fostered and therefore were maternally deprived, had a much lower IQ. Bowlby suggests this is because of maternal deprivation, and maternal deprivation affects your intellectual development. And that's Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. Identify one thing you learned about Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. Why do you think learning about Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation is important? How does this apply in real life? Who is this useful to? One more thing to bear in mind is that this research by Bowlby on maternal deprivation was done in the 50s, and since then child rearing practices have changed significantly, and it's not just the mother's responsibility to be the nurturing caregiver now, as we had a look at in the role of the father lesson. And that is Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. Good, we get it, we understand it. Tick it off. We're moving on to learning objective 2 to identify and analyze Bowlby's 1944 Thieves study. That's a really easy way to remember it. 1944 Thieves study. Never realised that before, but there we go. Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation suggested that the long-term consequences of deprivation was emotional maladjustment or even mental health problems such as depression. He demonstrated this in his key study of 44 juvenile thieves. This study examined the link between affectionless psychopathy and maternal deprivation. So bear in mind, Bowlby was actually a child psychologist. So he was working with these young juvenile delinquents, these young people that had done some sort of crimes. In this case, they were thieves. And this is what he found was common. The sample in this study consisted of 44 criminal teenagers accused of stealing. All of these thieves were interviewed for signs of affectionless psychopathy. So the characteristics of affectionless psychopathy are a lack of affection, lack of guilt about their actions, and a lack of empathy for their victims. Their families were also interviewed in order to establish whether the thieves had prolonged early separations from their mothers. A control group of non-criminal but emotionally disturbed young people was set up to see how often maternal deprivation occurred in the children who were not thieves. What do you think the research will find? Will Bowlby find evidence to support his claim that prolonged early deprivation caused affectionless psychopathy? Of course it does, it's his research. Bowlby found that 14 of the 44 thieves could be described as affectionless psychopaths. So that's not a large percentage, okay? So just because they were thieves, that doesn't mean that they were psychopaths, okay? But of the 14 affectionless psychopaths, 12 of them had experienced prolonged separation from their mothers in the first 2 years of their lives. The first 2 to 2.5 years, known also as the critical period. Good. In contrast, only 5 of the remaining 30 thieves had experienced separation. So what this found is if you were of these 44 thieves, they weren't necessarily affectionless psychopaths. But if you were an affectionless psychopath, it's likely that you're a psychopath, according to Bowlby, because you were separated from your mother during that critical period and therefore being maternally deprived. Of the control group, only 2 out of the 44 had experienced long separations, but none could be described as affectionless psychopaths. It was concluded that prolonged early separation and then therefore deprivation did in fact cause affectionless psychopathy. Now, there'll be lots of people that disagree with this, and that's perfectly up to you, but this is what Bowlby's research concluded. Bowlby concluded that there is little doubt in that for the affectionless thief, nurture, not nature, is to blame. Prolonged separation of a child from his mother in the first 5 years of life caused delinquent or criminal character behavior. Now, something to bear in mind, psychopaths are often stereotyped as unfeeling murderers, but the term refers to people who appear to have no conscience about what they do. They lack empathy for other people's feelings and experience little remorse. They can be very charming. Most recently, psychopathy has been called antisocial personality disorder in the DSM classification, or dissocial personality disorder in the ICD, and is thus seen as a category of mental illness. Here is an application question. Let's apply our knowledge. Maternal deprivation as a legal defense. Maternal deprivation has been associated with criminality, in particular criminality involving no empathy or guilt, Simon is a habitual criminal. Since his early teens, he has liberated many car stereos and shoplifted. More recently, he's turned to burglary and violent crime. Simon is now in court for mugging a 75-year-old. Simon studied psychology and decided to use the fact that his mother was in hospital for a time in his first year as a defense. How could Simon use the theory of maternal deprivation to excuse his actions? Right, give that a go. You've learned a little bit about this. Write your answer down. 5 minutes, give that a go. Here's the answer. Simon could claim that he failed to develop normal empathy or guilt because of his experience of maternal deprivation. This means that he does not have the same inhibitions about violence that most of us would experience, and he can't alter his behavior. It's not his fault. Okay? That would be his defense. Identify one thing you've learned about Bowlby's 44 Thieves study. Why do you think learning about this is important? How does this apply in real life? Who is this information useful to? Have a think about those questions. And that's the second learning objective done. We're ticking it off. Done. Now we're going to discuss and evaluate Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. Evaluation, AO3. What are some of the strengths and limitations of Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation? Right, first of all, the evidence may be poor. Bowlby drew on a number of sources of evidence for maternal deprivation, including studies of children orphaned during the Second World War, those growing up in a poor quality orphanages, and of course his 44 Thieves study. However, these are all flawed as evidence. War orphans were traumatized and often had poor aftercare. Therefore, these factors might have been the causes of later developmental difficulties rather than separation. So what this point is saying is that if an orphan, in this case that he looked at from from the Second World War, did end up having, say, intellectual or emotional disabilities, how do you know it's necessarily from the fact that the child was deprived of a mother, and not the fact that they had to grow up in times of war? Similarly, children growing up from birth in poor quality institutions were deprived of many aspects of care, not just maternal care. So those that have to grow up in orphanages, some orphanages are absolutely awful, and we're going to have a look at that next lesson, and they're not just deprived of parents, they're deprived of loads of things. They're deprived of love and nutrition sometimes. They're deprived of good living standards. They're deprived of good sleep, okay? Anything. So it could be any of those factors that cause them to have issues later on, not just the fact that they're deprived of a parent. So the evidence may be poor. There's also counter evidence. Not all research has supported Bowlby's findings. For example, Hilda Lewis partially replicated the 44 Thieves study on a larger scale, looking at 500 young people. In her sample, a history of early prolonged separation from the mother did not predict criminality or difficulty forming close relationships. This is a problem for the theory of maternal deprivation because it suggests that other factors may affect the outcome of early maternal deprivation. This is conflicting evidence, okay? How would you write that in appeal paragraph structure? Right, point, okay? There is conflicting evidence that goes against Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. Okay, that's just your point. Need some evidence now. Okay, Hilda Lewis replicated the findings and did not find that separation from the mother predicted criminality or forming close relationships. Okay, why is this a weakness? Right, why is this a limitation? This is a limitation because it conflicts with Bowlby's idea of maternal deprivation, because it suggests, now link it back to the question, that other factors may affect the outcome of early maternal deprivation. Okay, that is a limitation. Animal studies show effects of maternal deprivation though. Although most psychologists are very critical of the theory of maternal deprivation, an interesting line of research has provided some support for the idea that maternal deprivation can have long-term effects. Levy et al. Showed that separating baby rats from their mothers for as little as a day had a permanent effect on their social development, though not other aspects of development. This supports Bowlby's theory because it's showing that if you do separate a mother from its child, in this case a rat, it did result in issues in their social development. However, the obvious counterpoint is, can we generalize the findings from rats to humans? Because we are a lot more complex, our brain functions on a lot more complex level than that of a rat, so therefore the research isn't really applicable to humans. But it's still a supporting point, okay? It's still a strength. Right, summarize each evaluative point into exactly 10 words, right? We're condensing it down. Summarize them into 10 words. Give that a go. It's a challenge. Otherwise, that's the evaluation. We are close to finishing. All we got left now is the plenary. I've got some multiple choice questions for us. Give them a go. Answer them before I give the answer. Say them out loud. Number 1. Which of the following best describes maternal deprivation? A. Separation from the primary attachment figure. B. Failure to attach to a primary attachment figure. C. Failure of attachment figures to feed the infant. D. Loss of care of the primary attachment figure without a substitute. It is D, okay? Deprivation is not as simple as just separation. You need to lose the care, the love, the nurture. Number 2, the critical period in which prolonged separation can lead to deprivation is within the first what? A. 30 days. B. 30 weeks. C. 30 months. D. 30 years. Which one is it? A, B, C, or D? Say it out loud. It is C, 30 months. The first 2.5 years, 2 to 2.5 years is the critical period according to Bowlby. 3. Which of the following is true of the 44 Thieves study? A. There is no association between maternal deprivation and affectionless psychopathy. B. Partial replications by Lewis have found similar results. C. Results are not supported by those of Goldfarb. D. There may be bias because Bowlby assessed affectionless psychopathy and deprivation. Right, the answer was D. There may be bias, okay? Because it was Bowlby that was assessing the affectionless psychopathy. And number 4, last one, which of the following is not usually a symptom of affectionless psychopathy? A. Lack of empathy. B. Lack of guilt. C. Inability to form close relationships. D. Serial murderer. Right. The answer is D. Okay. If you're an affectionate psychopath, you're not necessarily a murderer. Okay. How did you do? How many questions did you get out of 4? Are you an absolute legend? And that was today's lesson. That was lesson 10, Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. Next lesson, we're looking at lesson 11, Romanian orphan studies, or the effects of institutionalization. Right, there we go. Well done, my neo-psychologists. Great work today. I'm really proud of you all. Keep up the good work. I've been Mr. Neo. God bless and peace.
I'm feeling like Will. I feel like a prince. I'm feeling myself. I'm loaded with bills. Cause I wasn't blessed with no Uncle Phil. Don't know how it feels. I wanted to flex. They told me to chill. I'm making a flip. My life is a flick. Now load up the film.